and she passed away. And, he was left with this feeling that it was his fault. And it took
Mm.
years for him to truly accept and understand that his theology was off because he blamed himself. Like, man, if I only had prayed more, if I had more faith, then my sister would still be here.
So let's talk about positive confession. There are some churches out there that teach almost in a very similar way to the New Age would teach manifestation, that you can sort of speak things into existence, or that your prayers have some sort of creative power to manifest something into reality that wouldn't otherwise be manifested. So what does the Bible teach about that? Does it teach positive confession? What verses are people using? Why is that, in your view, a dangerous thing to teach? And I would agree with that, by the way, that it is a dangerous thing to teach.
Yeah, well, once again, this is where things get really, really, guys. This was a hard book to write because there are so many nuances to this. So, in one aspect, you could say positive confession is biblical, right? So, let me be careful. Let me define that because somebody could take that soundbite. What I mean is this: if I am reciting affirmations like I am forgiven, I am loved, I am accepted, I am chosen, I am redeemed. That's positive confession. I am confessing positive things over my spirit that come from the scriptures and are properly interpreted from the scriptures. So affirmations in and of themselves aren't necessarily evil or wrong as long as they're interpreted correctly from the scriptures. In that aspect, yeah, it's good. But what we're talking about is this idea that many people from the Word of Faith movement teach and promote is that you and I are little gods.
Mm.
And once again, going back to what you mentioned earlier, this idea that we were created in the image of God. So, guys, this is exactly what I mean about context and proper hermeneutics, right? Many people from the Word of Faith movement will say that that verse in Genesis that talks about we were created in the image of God would suggest that, hey, and even I'll just say his name, even teachers like Creflo Dollar and others like Joyce Meyer will say things like, well,
Yeah.
if two dogs get together, what do they create? A dog. Two cats get together, what do they create? Cats. Horses get together, what do they create? Horses. If God gets together and creates something, what does he create? Little gods. And that's literally a direct quote from a Creflo Dollar sermon, a direct quote, right? And so from that, the idea is that if God created the world with his words and he had the power to speak things into existence, i.e. the universe, if we're created his image, we have the power to create things as well. Guys, think about that. That's just not biblically accurate, nor is it even consistent with our own personal experience.
Mm.
Try telling somebody who has not been able to conceive and they've
Mm.
had miscarriages, try telling that woman, speak a child into existence. And if you speak it, you can have, guys, we got to stop this stuff, right? Like that's just not biblically accurate. Anyway, what are your thoughts? I could go on and on
No,
about
that's
that.
that's so good because I do think there are streams of the church, and I want to just reiterate, someone who might be falling for this, it doesn't mean you're not a Christian. It doesn't mean that there aren't brothers and sisters in Christ that are falling for these things. I love that you kind of made that distinction earlier. If you're in a church that's teaching you Jesus is not God or he hasn't been resurrected, that's a different category. That's heresy. That's not Christianity that we're talking about anymore. But there can be error within the true church. And so people might be falling for this idea that your words have this creative power. And I think you just really touched on the danger of that and just the harm that that can bring there at the end when you brought up the example of the woman who can't conceive. Well, is she supposed to just speak that into existence? And this also, I think, applies to where we started with the whole idea that Jesus' atonement sort of purchased your physical healing here on earth, because then what that leaves people with is that, okay, let's say I get sick. Let's say that I am dying or I even die of some disease. Well, how do you make sense of that? If your theological belief is that that was purchased through the atoning sacrifice of Jesus, well, then it has to be that you didn't have enough faith, or maybe there's some unrepentant sin in your life. So in other words, it's your
Exactly.
fault.
It's
And
your
that
fault.
can end up gaslighting people spiritually, because I've known great saints of God that have died of cancer who
Yes.
praised God and served him all the way to the end.
Absolutely.
And we're faithful examples of Christians. And it's just it can just be so harmful to teach something. And I know people don't mean to. I know when somebody teaches this, they want to encourage. They're wanting to do something that will make people's lives better. But if we don't think it through all the way to the end, it can end up being quite harmful.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's funny that you mentioned that because in my book, I guys, I tried to write the book as part fiction and part nonfiction, where every chapter starts off with a fictional story of a character I've named Jaren, and essentially Jaren is trying to find a church, and every time he tries to find a healthy church, he runs into another one of these false teachings that derails his life. And some of these stories from Jaren's life are actually either my stories or stories of friends that I have. And exactly what you just said, Elise, is I one of the stories in there, spoiler alert, is about a friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, as a matter of fact, who um, lost his sister to cancer.
Mm.
And he had everybody praying for her, trusting God for her healing. And she passed away. And, he was left with this feeling that it was his fault. And it took
Mm.
years for him to truly accept and understand that his theology was off because he blamed himself. Like, man, if I only had prayed more, if I had more faith, that my sister would still be here. And that's oftentimes why this thing is so damaging. And then you start blaming God. See,
Yeah.
first you blame yourself, and then you start realizing, well, God, if you promised that my sister was to be healed based on what Jesus did on the cross, and she didn't, then that means you failed me.
Yeah.
And that's where we have to make sure we're careful with our theology.